Good evening, everyone. My name is Julia Grimes, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Dunhuang Foundation, and it is my tremendous pleasure to welcome you here tonight on behalf of the Foundation. We know many of you have navigated time zone and connectivity issues to join us for this evening's lecture, and we'd like to express our deep gratitude for your continued support. It's my honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Sanjyot Mehendale. Sanjyot Mehendale obtained her PhD in Near Eastern Studies from the University of California at Berkeley. Since 1997, she has been teaching Central Asian and Silk Roads art and archaeology in the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Berkeley. From 2001 to 2005, she was co-director of the Uzbek Berkeley Archaeological Mission. During the same period, she was executive director of the Caucasus and Central Asian program. Among Dr. Mehendale's main research concerns is a focus on the Kushan period, in particular on trade and cultural exchange and the relationship between Kushan kingship and Buddhist institutions. A recipient of a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship, she has developed, in collaboration with the Electronic Cultural Atlas Initiative, a digital archive of the Begram ivory and bone carvings, which were once housed in the National Museum in Kabul, Afghanistan. The author of several articles on Silk Roads art and archaeology, she is the co-editor of Central Asia and the Caucasus, Transnationalism and Diaspora, published by Routledge in 2005. At Berkeley, Sanjyot Mehendale is chair of the PY and Kinmay W. Tang Center for Silk Road Studies, and vice chair of the Center for Buddhist Studies. Professor Mehendale's topic this evening will be Afghanistan, at the heart of the Silk Roads. Without further ado, please join me now in welcoming her.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Julia, for that very generous introduction. I would also like to thank the Dunhuang Foundation for inviting me to give a talk, Chris Hudak for facilitating my participation and for being such a wonderful colleague in our academic, educational, and outreach partnership. And I also want to thank all of you for taking the time to join us today. Let me share my screen. This seems once again an important moment to talk about Afghanistan, in particular since the American withdrawal has brought renewed attention to the plight of the Afghans and raised concern about the future of Afghanistan's cultural heritage under Taliban rule. Now, I have to begin by saying that I don't see myself as an expert on Afghanistan's 20th century history, nor on Afghan culture. I've never had the opportunity to conduct archaeological fieldwork in situ, although most of my research has focused on Afghanistan's visual and material remains. Further, I don't purport really to have an answer to what is happening on the ground, nor do I have an insight on into what the future of Afghanistan will hold or should be. In addition, I must confess a certain disquiet in choosing cultural heritage as a topic, while communities in Afghanistan, destabilized by decades of war, continue to suffer the violent effects of conflict and geopolitical jockeying, if I may, on their bodies, their minds, their livelihoods, and the well-being of their families and communities. Really, what can art and archaeology contribute in this context? And that's been on my mind for quite some time. That being said, I'm grateful to have been provided the opportunity to talk about Afghanistan, since there continues to be little attention paid to the country's rich and complex history and culture. And Central Asia remains largely a peripheral region in the study of Asian art. And when studied at all, it's mostly viewed as a transit zone, right, between China, India, Persia, and the Mediterranean Europe, with little or no focus on the central role in millennia of exchanges across Eurasia. The story then that I would like to weave together is meant to highlight some of the material and visual culture of Afghanistan that underscores that centrality. But I want to note that my talk comes with certain caveats. In the first place, the present boundaries of Afghanistan are of little use when discussing the past. Afghanistan did not exist as a nascent state and land of the Afghans until at least the 18th century, the 18th century establishment of the Durrani Empire. And its present borders, as you can see on the map to the right, weren't formalized until the 19th century. And that was done in the context of British and Russian colonial expansion. Before then, it had never been a politically unified area. Rather, parts of Afghanistan, what is now modern Afghanistan, were under control of successive Central Asian, Near Eastern, and South Asian dynasties. It's a country really whose modern history and borders belie its deep-seated trans-regional and transnational character. So in this talk, I will often refer to either the Afghan region or Central Asia rather than Afghanistan. The second problem is the question of what to cover in a lecture of 15 minutes, right? The most obvious choice in the context of a talk sponsored by the Dunhuang Foundation would have been to highlight the country's Buddhist art and architecture. But I've chosen not to do this exclusively for the simple reason that Buddhism, like the expansion of Alexander the Great and the so-called Hellenization of the East, is what most scholarship has always focused on, to the detriment of the region's other constituent parts, nomadic, Iranic, Indic, and Islamic, among others. So what I'm hoping to present to you today is an overview of the diverse environment and rich cultural heritage that situates the region at the heart of millennia-old Eurasian trading networks. A survey that will allow you, I hope, as mentioned in the blurb for this talk, to view the region not only rich, but also richly diverse, not isolated and insulated, but deeply and complexly engaged with other cultures near and far. This talk then is really meant to set the stage for perhaps future talks on particular or detailed areas of interest. And I hope, as is my wont, that I haven't bitten off more than I can chew today. So Afghanistan is most imagined as rugged, barren, or desert-like. And indeed, it has neither fluvial access to open sea, neither direct or fluvial access to open sea, and as such has an arid continental climate. It is hemmed into by the barricades of its own rugged mountains. Approximately, 1/3, if not half of the country lies at elevations over 2,000 meters, while parts of eastern Afghanistan, so this Badakhshan, the Eastern Mountains, and the Pamian Knot sit between 4,000 and 7,000 meters and are covered most of the year with a thick layer of snow, which makes travel extremely hazardous and often impossible during the long, cold winter months. The most significant of Afghanistan's mountain chains is the Hindu Kush and its contiguous ranges, which bifurcate the country. Now, a few important passes, such as here, the Salang through the Hindu Kush and the Khyber between Afghanistan and Pakistan became important arteries for trade and connectivity from one area to the next. That was true in the past and of course is also true in the present. Now, that being said, despite its rather desolate image, and that's viewed in particularly from the outside, several regions in Afghanistan, such as here in Bamiyan province, contain fertile river valleys, which receive a large measure of water from melted snow, allowing for irrigation and intense cultivation. In particular, the northern area, known as Bactria in ancient times and made fertile by the Oxus or Amudarya, Oxus River, was noted for its beauty and fertility. And the banks of the Amudarya and its tributaries were often lined with lush vegetation, such as you can see in this photograph. Now, textual sources extol the beauty of the area and the splendor of some of the cities that rose up in ancient Afghanistan. The Chinese pilgrim who traveled through, the region in the 7th century, the Chinese pilgrim Senzang, who traveled through the region in the 7th century, reported that its capital, Balkh, was surrounded by lush groves. And later Arab geographers in the 9th century called the capital Balkh the Beautiful, or the mother of all cities, on a par with ancient Samarkand or Bukhara. Now, the remains of such splendid cities of ancient Afghanistan were laid bare by a century of archaeological work, which in the beginning were largely driven by colonial, political, and economic interests. So the first European explorations of Afghanistan took place during the time of the so-called Great Game, in the context of British expansion, on the eve of what would be the First Anglo-Afghan War of 1839. And these were deeply intertwined with intelligence gathering. One of the most important players at that time was Charles Masson, an explorer / agent of the British East India Company, and a keen archaeologist who was particularly interested at the time in tracing Alexander the Great's conquest of the region. By 1838, he had mapped many of the sites around Kabul and Jalalabad, and the latter city shown here in a drawing that accompanied his reports. He collected thousands of objects that ultimately found their way to London, first into the British East India Company's so-called India Museum, and then to the British Museum, which today still houses the Masson, the so-called Masson collection. Now, the work of Masson and other European colonial personnel paved the way after Afghan independence, which was 1919, for the development of a more systematic exploration and excavation, alongside the development of an institutional infrastructure for archaeological research. Until the 1950s, the dominant European player would be France, with the establishment of the French Archaeological Delegation of Afghanistan, known by its acronym DAFA, which secured, through a formal agreement with the Afghan government in 1922, a near monopoly on archaeological research in Afghanistan over the next 30 years. It would also lead to the building of large collections of objects that came to be housed in Musée Guimet, in Paris, France's premier Asian art museum. Now, the birth of DAFA coincided with the rise of a new Afghan state, first under Emir and later King Amanullah Khan, shown on the left with his wife, Queen Soraya, and later under Zahir Shah from 1933 to 1973, here photographed with JFK. The flagship National Museum of Afghanistan in Kabul came to articulate this vision for a new, modernized, and internationally engaged Afghanistan. Kabul University was founded and fostered partnerships with the governments of Turkey, with France, with Germany, and the United States. In the early decades of its establishment, the work of the DAFA, which by now had attracted prominent Afghan literati and academics, such as Ahmed Ali Khozad, who would become the curator of the National Museum and director of the Afghan Historical Society, the work that they did collectively primarily focused on the pre-Islamic heritage of Afghanistan, in particular, the extent of the penetration of Greek culture and the spread of Buddhism. And those two topics really helped underscore Afghanistan's cosmopolitanism at the time. The primacy of DAFA was reduced after World War II, when new joint archaeological projects brought a slew of German, Italian, Russian, even a few American archaeologists, among others, to take part in large-scale projects. And these stretched all the way from Afghanistan's prehistory to the Mughal Empire. Excavations were launched in all corners of the country, including around the cities of Herat, Kandahar, Jalalabad, and Balkh, the aforementioned Balkh. What also happened was that the first Afghan-led excavation projects commenced, such as in 1965, the one around the Buddhist site of Hadda under direction of Zemari Alai Tarzi. A year later, the Archaeology Institute of Afghanistan would be founded, which together with the Ministry of Information and Culture and the National Museum of Afghanistan in Kabul became the main institutional partners for the development of joint projects. By the late 70s, however, on the eve of the Soviet invasion of 1979, and until 2001, most international projects would cease, leaving Afghan colleagues to their own devices in a rapidly destabilizing situation. Some left the country, but many remained and continued their work really under increasingly harrowing conditions. Well into 2001, when the Taliban was first defeated following the 9/11 attacks. By the end of the 1970s, 50 years of archaeological work had led to the identification and excavation of thousands of major archaeological sites, highlighting the country's rich archaeological past and its position on the crossroads or at the crossroads of large exchange networks that we, starting in the 19th century, would come to define as the Silk Road. But long before the assumed development of this so-called Silk Road, already in the Bronze Age, 3rd, 2nd millennium BCE, cities across the Afghan region, such as Mundigak, shown on this slide, demonstrated a vigorous economic life based on agriculture, and this was made possible by large-scale irrigation networks. They had highly efficient animal breeding, craftsmanship, and trade. And networks of exchange then already connected Central Asia to the West and South, as demonstrated here by shared artistic trends, such as in the ceramics from Pakistan and present-day Pakistan and Iran. Known for its natural resources, Central Asia during this time also seemed to have been an economic bulwark for surrounding societies. The development of the well-known 3rd and 2nd millennium BCE Indus Valley culture seems to some extent have been dependent on a key natural resource that Afghanistan had to offer, lapis lazuli. This is witnessed by the Indus Valley outpost of Shortugai, which was built for the exploitation of this precious commodity in the Afghan Badakhshan mountains, to be exported to Persia and Egypt, among others. Oh, sorry, too fast. There we go. So here you can see some examples of lapis work from Egypt and also from Iran. That lapis would remain a valuable export, a commodity going east over the next millennia is demonstrated by the use of the stone in later Persian and Chinese sculpture, as well as here at pigments that were ultimately used in the Kizil and Dunhuang paintings. Now, due to the lack of written sources or local written sources, right, of that period, we know very little about the inner workings of Bronze Age societies. Research suggests that in the region, Indo-Iranian languages were most probably spoken, but it's not until the 1st millennium BCE that sources point to a largely Iranian-speaking nomadic and agricultural population of Central Asia, the latter of whose beliefs were associated in part with a fire cult, a tradition that may have had its roots in the late Bronze Age in Central Asia, but that would be first articulated in a religion more familiarly known as Zoroastrianism, ascribed to the prophet Zarathustra, or Zoroaster in Greek, who some even speculate was born in present-day Afghanistan, perhaps the aforementioned city of Balkh. Zoroastrianism would reach its apex and is most known really as the state religion of the ancient and medieval Persian empires, centered on present-day Iran, such as the Achaemenids and Sasanians, who are indicated on this map. Whether or not the earlier Indo-Iranian communities of Central Asia were Zoroastrian per se, as codified in the sacred scriptures, the Avesta, and later texts, is unclear. But the first temples with evidence of a fire cult appear in the second millennium BCE, such as the one attested in northern Afghanistan at Telyatepe. Excavated in the late 1970s by a joint Afghan-Soviet team, the mound's earliest levels reveal a massive monument containing a mud brick altar with remnants of ashes. Here you can see it in the ground plan cross-section, and this is the site on the map. It bears a similarity with earlier Bronze Age temples across the border in Turkmenistan, across the border to the north. Although religiously diverse, Zoroastrianism would remain the religion most associated with the local Iranian-speaking communities until the coming of Islam. One such community to the north of present-day Afghanistan, the Saudians, ubiquitous along the Silk Road, as many of you probably know, would carry much later carry aspects of their tradition into China. This starts probably from the 5th century onwards, as demonstrated by representations of fire ritual on Sogdian funerary monuments excavated in China. One of the earliest extant Zoroastrian manuscripts, perhaps, by the way, a folio of a sacred prayer, was discovered at Dunhuang, transcribed into Sogdian, an Eastern Iranian language. But let's stay with the first millennium BCE. It is during the aforementioned Persian Achaemenid era, from the 6th to 4th centuries BCE, often referred to as the First World Empire, since its expansionist policies brought a vast region under its control, that Central Asia first enters the historical record. And Afghanistan would comprise, or the region of Afghanistan, would comprise several important eastern provinces of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, including Bactria, Gandhara, and Arakhosha, or the latter around Kandahar. The dominance achieved by the Achaemenids in an economically developed Central Asia played a significant role in the overall position attained in Eurasia by the Great Persian Empire. As Andre Gunder Frank has put it, the key area of logistical interlinkage in the world economy, or he calls it world system, shifted from Syria and the Levant to Central Eurasia. Achaemenid control of Central Asian cities were very important elements in consolidating Persian super accumulation. Now, delegations from the far reaches of the Achaemenid Empire, Bactria, Gandhara, also nomadic areas to the north, Scythia, are shown bearing gifts from their home regions to the Persian king at his ceremonial capital in Persepolis. And this is really a visual representation of the center's political and economic dominance of the Afghan region, among others. The early domination by Persian dynasties was interrupted by a period of Greek hegemony. The empire created by Alexander the Great on the ashes of the Achaemenid Empire in the Near East and Central Asia, and maintained by Alexander's local successors, the Greco-Bactrians, which you can see in the map on the right, sent waves of Greek culture into the region. It is this place and time, often referred to as the Hellenized East, that has received most of the attention Western scholarship has paid to the region. And while archaeological finds, including these Greco-Bactrian coins, certainly attest to the penetration of Greek administrative idioms, language, and pantheon of gods into the cultures of Central Asia, the true extent of direct Greek political and cultural transformation of the region remained largely unknown until the 1960s discovery of the famous city of Aihanum in northeastern Afghanistan. Founded at the turn of the 3rd century BCE by Alexander's immediate successors, it probably became the seat of power of the local Greco-Bactrian dynasty from the 3rd to the mid-2nd century BCE, with a mixed Greek and Bactrian population. Excavated under direction of the French archaeological delegation in Afghanistan, the site boasts many elements of a typical Greek city. It has a theater, a gymnasium, but it also, it's the Corinthian, right, capital point sort of to that connection. But simultaneously, the archaeology also underscored the local Persian/Iranic character of, for example, its palatial architecture, which connects more to the Persian Achaemenid style, and also the usage of local building styles and materials, among others. The treasury of Aihanum, stacked during the time of the Bactrian ruler Eucratides I, and here you can see in his coin, one of his mints, included implements of administration, writing material, scale weights. It also included objects that Eucratides probably brought back from his campaigns in India, such as this inlaid, very beautiful inlaid plaque. And it also contained, most probably, objects of trade. Now, the inscriptions on these ceramic storage jars, they record coin deposits, measures of olive oil, and other goods. The treasury also contained precious stones, local ones, perhaps agate, lapis lazuli, but also ones that came from outside, sapphire, carnelian, that possibly came from Sri Lanka or India. Other materials also included coral, perhaps from the Mediterranean, turquoise, perhaps from Persia. Now, the power of the Greek visual idiom and the Greek language and alphabet has overlaid on the local Iranian Bactrian language would prove to be, or Iranian languages, sorry, I meant to say, would prove to be remarkably persistent well into the Common Era. When the Indian Emperor Ashoka Maurya pushed the borders of his empire into present-day southern Afghanistan, he had his proclamations inscribed in Aramaic and Greek, a recognition really of the long embedded languages of political power. And here you see his famous bilingual tablet, which was discovered in Kandahar in southern Afghanistan, in which Ashoka promotes the adoption of his ethos of piety. Some have said this should be translated to Dharma. And note sort of the use of the Greek eusebia to translate the concept of piety, truth. The deep-rooted urban agrarian culture of the northern plains of ancient Afghanistan was challenged by waves of mobile pastoral groups that swept into the region in the 2nd century BCE. So nomadic confederacies from the steppe regions of Central Asia, such as the Saka, the Scythians, and the Yuaja, whose migration is indicated on the map on the left, would put an end to local Greek rule in Bactria and its center of power, the city of Aihanum. And brilliantly reflected in the objects from the Tilla Tepe necropolis, you can see on the map, these nomads would bring their steppe traditions into an already very diverse cultural environment. So excavations in the higher strata of the Tilla Tepe mound, which I had discussed earlier or referenced earlier, identified the graves of 5 women and 1 man who were buried in hollow pits in legged wooded coffins, which were either wrapped with cloth or in one instance inserted into a leather case. Here you can see the plan of the site on the left with the burials indicated in blue and red, blue for the female burials and red for the male. This is a cross section of what such shaft burials look like. And this is an in situ photograph of the 6th burial, a burial of a very decked out woman. Now, in contrast to their plain surroundings, the dead were really dressed in elaborate ceremonial costumes. The women were dressed in long ornamental robes and tunics and were adorned with elaborate gold jewelry. The long decorative band in front of the kaftan-like garment is very reminiscent of the type of Iranian costumes that were worn and continue to be worn across Central Asia. And you can see that later in depictions of Kushan art and also Heptalite art. The sole man in the burial complex was clad in a very typical nomadic costume, short jacket, trousers, and boots. Now, a number of imported objects that were found among the grave goods point to the region's wide trading connections. So a mirror discovered in one of the graves testifies to contact with Han China. Coins of the Parthian king and the Roman Emperor Tiberius connect this area with regions to the west. And you also have an Indian coin and possibly Indianesque seal. It depicts a zebu, a humpback bull. Most importantly, as products of largely from one local goldsmithing workshop, most of the gold objects underscore the local blending of what we would easily classify into categories of Greco-Roman, Persian, nomadic, Indian artistic elements. For example, most of the Tilla Tepe finds consists of thousands of small objects sewn upon the garments that were worn by the deceased. This is a tradition that connects well to the northern Central Asian grasslands, the steppe regions, as demonstrated by similar appliques that are found on garments worn by the earlier nomadic Scythians, contemporary Scythians, and Sarmatians. And I give you this one photograph. It's from a burial, a specific burial of a female. It's called the Ukok burial, discovered at Pazyryk in the Siberian Altai. And you can see her, the gold objects all over her body. Other objects also have clear analogies with the art of the steppe. So for example, some plaques were in animal style, very typical of what you find in the nomadic areas to the north. But then there were other images, other representations. So 2 small images of a winged figure leaning on a column. One wearing a pointed turban and chest harness, the other a censor's chiton. They're both, or draped sort of lower garment, both leaning on a column, both surprisingly and uniquely winged, but they're very similar to an iconography that is associated with the goddess Aphrodite across or Venus across the Greco-Roman world. There are other sort of allusions to the Greek mythological sphere, this clasp for example, depicts probably the god Dionysus with Ariadne, which replicates a very popular story and representation of Greek mythology. But once again, it's sort of in a decidedly local fashion, with the couple portrayed sitting on a griffin. Yet another pendant from a hair ornament from the burials brings to mind both the animal style art of the steppe regions, depicting a man clutching two dragons with contorted hindquarters, twisted hindquarters, which connects to the aforementioned art of Pazyryk, as you can see in the comparative image. But the garb that he's wearing connects much more to the Persian Achaemenid world. There was also an interesting connection to the east, to Han China, a small chariot depicted, drawn by dragons, made of bamboo. These are shoe buckles that the man was wearing. And the costume and physiognomy of the individual in that wagon really points to an Eastern connection, perhaps China or Mongolia. Lastly, the Tilla Tepe gold also reflected sort of this larger Indo-Iranian world in its repertoire of motifs. So, for example, this swastika, this emblem of good luck and good fortune, was very prevalent across the region, and you can see it as a comparison as early as the Indus Valley period, Bronze Age. These nomadic confederacies that roamed the northern plains of Afghanistan would be unified under a single banner around the turn of the Common Era by a clan that we know from from textual and epigraphic sources as the Kushans, who carved out an empire in the early centuries of the Common Era, which would eventually stretch from modern Uzbekistan in the north to the Ganges Valley in India in the south. Now, their coins, with the portrait of the ruler on the obverse and the divine source of his power on the reverse, can be seen to really illustrate the cross-cultural currents of the region. On their coins and in other iconic images, the Kushans utilized a selection of popular deities from the Greco-Roman, Iranian, and Indian pantheons, to legitimize their rule over what we might, in modern contexts, call a multicultural society. In these examples, one can see the Kushan king Kanishka on the obverse, interestingly with his hand directed to a small fire altar, perhaps. And this alludes to a royal ritual involving fire, which may point to this Iranic Zoroastrian background. One of their temples that was uncovered in Afghanistan, temples of the Kushans, it's called the Temple of Kota. It's perched on a hill near the city of Puli Kumri in Baghlan province in Afghanistan. And it was built to contain statues of kings of the dynasty and also contained a central altar that you can see there. Now, no remains of ashes were discovered on the main altar, so we don't know whether they had, a central fire or a sacred fire. However, a smaller shrine in the back, which is indicated on the map on the left, seemed to contain one. Now, an inscription, a Kushan inscription found in the vicinity of Surkotal, written in the Bactrian language, which, by the way, was written in Greek script. Talk about blending. This inscription suggests that the temples were built to contain statues of kings and a slew of deities from which the kings derived their right to rule. Now, the upswing in the use of gold coins in the late 1st and early 2nd century CE during the Kushan period, indicates an increase in wealth as the Kushans took control of the lucrative trade routes that crisscrossed the region. Now, although we know that trading networks existed as far back as the Bronze Age, as discussed before, in general, the focus of scholarship concerning the Silk Roads begins around the turn of the Common Era, a few centuries BC and first century BC, something like that. The political climate at the time was fertile for the development and strengthening of commercial and cultural ties across Eurasia. The relatively simultaneous existence on outward-looking propensities, I would argue, of the Han dynasty in China, the Kushan Empire in Central Asia, the Parthians in the Near East, and the Roman Empire in the West, this is thought to have really spurred the expansion of long-distance trade and institutionalized trade, meaning that the infrastructure, the kings, rulers would invest in the infrastructure for that trade, roads, protection, right, etc. The Han were particularly interested in goods that were coming from Western Central Asia, which were mentioned in the reports that envoys brought back. So the region of Sogdiana, Bactria, Ferghana, Gandhara. The Romans, we know, had a large appetite for Eastern exotica, invested very heavily in foreign trade, so much so that some contemporary authors really started complaining about the depletion of the Roman treasury. Now, if you piece together archaeological and textual sources, you get the familiar picture that has emerged of the routes leading to and from the heart of the Chinese Empire, through the Hershey corridor into the Taklamakan Desert in modern Gansu and Xinjiang province, where then the route bifurcates into a northern and southern route along the edges of the desert and the adjoining sort of mountain chains. And these main roads then, as you well know, come together again at the western end of the Tarim Basin at Kashgar. And from there, several routes continued into the region of Central Asia west of the Pamir. And this area then west of the Pamir, where Afghanistan is located, served as a hub for many of the smaller spokes also coming from the east, west, and south. And in addition to the so-called oasis-linked routes, right, through the desert region, there were northern routes which led through the steppe regions of Central Asia, creating larger, extremely fluid networks that crisscrossed the continent. Both land and sea routes, as you can see on this map, were utilized by various mercantile groups who would weave together these regional nodes into what came to constitute one large Eurasian trading network of the early centuries of the Common Era. Now, the fabulous site of Begram, and I'm very partial to it because that's my doctoral work was on Begram, demonstrates how networks came together to move merchandise back and forth between present-day Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, China, and the Mediterranean, among others. Begram, which might resonate more as Bagram, right, the erstwhile site of the US NATO base, is situated at the confluence of two rivers, the Gurband and Panjshir. It's about 40 miles north of Kabul, but it's the larger geographic setting of Begram that is particularly striking. So to the south, which you can see on the map on the right, lie the Kodaman Plains, which stretch all the way to Kabul. To the southeast, the Panjshir River and valley flow down toward the Jalalabad Plains, also indicated on the map, from where it is a relatively easy journey to the Khyber Pass, connecting the region with major sites in what is now Pakistan and on to India. To the north of Begram rise the high mountain ranges of the Hindu Kush, but a number of passes, and the Salang Pass are already indicated, have always made it possible to travel through the mountains to the Turkestan Plains, north of the Hindu Kush, and then on to the ancient kingdom of Bactria. And this really placed Bagram directly on the renowned lines of communication from Bactria to India. Now, Bagram was the site of extensive coin collecting in the 19th century by the aforementioned Charles Masson, but wasn't systematically excavated until the 1930s under direction of the Dafa. Here are two photographs of the team working on the site. And the site is primarily known for a large cache of objects, which was discovered in two rooms in the ancient town. Here seen in the ground plan with the corresponding area indicated in the satellite image on the right. Hundreds of objects were uncovered in two rooms and consisted of a wide array of materials of varying origin. One group of objects had their place of origin Roman Egypt. Amongst these were circular plaster medallions with scenes depicted in low or high relief, many scenes connecting to Greco-Roman mythology. Different types of glassware were also uncovered, including a number of spectacular painted glass beakers, which you can see above, with also carrying scenes either of daily life or of Greek mythology, and a number of pillar molded bowls, beautiful pillar molded bowls you can see on the left. In addition to those coming from a westerly direction, the Bagram finds also included a number of now long gone, destroyed Chinese lacquer bowls. Because of their perishability, only a few fragments remain, but they clearly indicate a Han Dynasty timeline for their production and their place of origin. In addition to those objects from westerly region and the east, there was a third large corpus of materials that seemed to come from the Indian world. And they consisted of delicately carved and sculpted ivory and bone plaques that formed the outer decorative layer of furniture, chairs, you can see on the left, and footstools. These were photographs taken in Kabul Museum. Such sets are indicated in the ivories themselves. So here you can see the chair back, and here you can see the accompanied footstool. Now, by comparing the finds of Bagram to similar objects discovered at different sites, a fascinating picture really emerges of the nature and extent of ancient Silk Road trade to and from the region of Afghanistan. Now, the distribution of similar Roman glassware along the coastal regions of both the Arabian Peninsula and India indicates that much of the Bagram Roman ware arrived by sea further south and then traveled north, perhaps intended to connect two routes leading overland to China, as evinced by the Bagram lacquer find. In this early Common Era stage, the sea routes to China had not been fully developed. And so the Bagram network points to a combination still of routes to and from China. Now, given the web-like complexity of those so-called Silk Roads and the great distances that they brought together, it's really no surprise that along these routes, many cultural trends and ideas were diffused. We all probably know that oasis towns of the Silk Road became destinations for religious communities from the West, such as Manichaeans, Nestorian Christians, missionaries, merchants, migrants from distant lands, were all instrumental in the spread of religious thinking and practices. Most prominently, of course, it's over these routes that Buddhism would make its way from India into Central Asia, from where it could move on to China. And in addition to the overland routes, maritime networks too were instrumental in moving Buddhism east. And this map really nicely articulates the symbiotic relationship between trade and the spread of Buddhism into Central Asia. And archaeology has revealed extensive Buddhist monuments in the vicinity of large trading settlements, which continue to flourish well into the Islamic period. Now, by the time Buddhism reached Gandhara in earnest, so northwest Pakistan, southeast Afghanistan in the early Common Era, Hellenistic ideals had become entrenched there, finding expression really in a style that was different than the reliefs of earlier Buddhist sites in India. Although the subject matter and repertory of motifs were much the same as in India, the cultural mix of the forms in which it was presented differed greatly. And this style is very well reflected in the Buddhist monuments, for example, of the Jalalabad area in eastern Afghanistan, such as around the site of Hadda. The Tapa Shotor excavation really revealed the continued relevancy of the Greek visual idiom well into the 2nd century CE. In this now, in this now destroyed sculpture, the Bodhisattva Vajrapani is depicted as a Greek god as he flanks the Buddha with a thunderbolt of Vajra in his hand. But rather than seeing these as the proof of the superiority of the Greek tradition over local trends and referring to the artisans always as Greek-inspired or Hellenistic, I think the Gandhara visual idiom is better viewed as uniquely local, the result of a dual process of localizing Hellenistic ideals and Hellenizing local traditions, which led patrons and carvers to see themselves as part of a larger artistic milieu. Over time, these local customs were absorbed into new traditions, and new traditions became localized. In a similar way, as I imagine occurred in the context of the textual tradition, right? Buddhism needed to foment a new visual language to translate concepts new to the area. Now, in the 3rd century, the Kushan territories were overtaken by a powerful new empire, the Persian Sasanians, which emerged from the same Iranian heartland as had the earlier Achaemenids. The course and extent of Sasanian domination or its influence on the Eastern Iranic societies in Central Asia is little known, but it seems that the local Kushan rulers recognized Sasanians as their sovereigns, as demonstrated by the term Kushanshar, Kushan province, and the title Kushan Shah. Regardless of the extent of their political control, archaeological evidence and a study of the arts of Central Asia and the Silk Road certainly reveal the prominence of the Sasanians in the region's trade and cultural exchange. The Sasanians memorialized the annexation of Afghanistan by carving a royal relief at the site of Ragi Bibi in northern Afghanistan, which shows a Sasanian king, some speculate Shapur I, hunting a rhinoceros, dating perhaps to the 3rd century CE, or maybe a little bit later. The almost 5 by 6.5 meter rock carving mirrors the reliefs carved in Persia, which announced a new trend with the appearance of larger-than-life rock reliefs in this region. The hunt was a favorite theme in Sasanian art, as seen in the reliefs at Takibustan, where the king is depicted in one relief taking part in a hunt and shown in another on horseback. Sasanian royal attire would become the standard wear for political elites all along the Central Asian Silk Road, as witnessed in Sogdiana, at Kizil, and other parts of Central Asia. And in particular, here are the images. In particular, the so-called pearl-bordered medallion or rondelle became a very favored design in textiles and painting. So you could see it here at Kizil and also in the art of ancient Samarkand in Sogdiana. And here are some actual textiles with the same motifs, one from Sasanian territory, the other found in graves in Turfan, and this a Saudian's child's coat. In the 4th and 5th century, an expansion from the northeast of Turkic-speaking populations, including Huns and Turks, pressured the Iranian mobile, pastoral, and sedentary communities of Central Asia. And I don't want you to get more dizzy than you probably already are, but you can name the Kidarites, the Heftalites. You have the Western Turks in the 7th century, and they come to dominate the region of Afghanistan in a kind of uneasy relationship with the Sasanian, Persian, and Kushan local rulers. Neither the Sasanians or the Altaic confederacies, these Turkic confederacies, seem to have impacted the diverse cultural environment of medieval Afghanistan too much. Buddhism continued to flourish under local rulers, and many of the Turkic dynasties seem to have adopted artistic and political idioms of their predecessors. And this is best reflected in the arts of Bamiyan, where the traditions, the iconographic traditions of Indian Buddhism, Central Asian Buddhism, combined with elements derived from Gandharan art, would be fused with those coming from Sasanian Persia. Bamiyan is located in the basin of the Hindu Kush Mountains and was also a major stopping place along the ancient trade routes, already in the 3rd century CE. Bamiyan's longevity as an active site lasted until the 8th century CE, during which time hundreds of caves were carved out of a cliff, which extends for about 1,300 meters from east to west, and is about 150 meters high. You all know, of course, the famous colossal Buddhas of Bamiyan, but many of the caves were painted. There are donor images, possibly of Heptalite donors, Heftalites having their center of power there. And many of the visual and artistic elements, flavor, if you will, of the Buddhism, the Buddhist visual culture of Bamiyan, points to a relationship with the Persian world. Now, that Bamiyan was active, very much active in the 7th century. Still, the colossal Buddhas date from the 6th century, is referenced in the records of the Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang. So here are two paragraphs, one where he identifies the colossal figures. And then the second, very interestingly, he talks about trade, where he says the merchants, in arranging their prices as they come and go, fall in with the signs afforded by the spirits. If good, they act accordingly. If evil, they seek to propitiate the powers. And then he goes on to name all the different Buddhist monastic institutions. So a lot of as I said, the artistic elements of Bamiyan connect to the Persian world. So these fluttering ribbons from behind the head, right, of the Bodhisattva on the left, mimic the fluttering ribbons of the Sasanian royal imagery. Other things that would be of importance in terms of Bamiyan going east, Bamiyan, actually the caves, the so-called lantern cave. I don't know why my thing is doing this. The lantern roof, here you can see it at Bamiyan, of course, finds its way into the architecture, cave architecture at Kizil, and then also as a design element in Dunhuang. The final sort of dynasty that I can get to probably in this talk, because we're nearing sort of 5 o'clock already, I see, were the Turk Shahi kingdoms of the 7th century. Remnants of the different sort of Turkic confederacies that came down and settled in the area of Afghanistan. And from that period dates a very beautiful site that doesn't get highlighted often enough, the site of Fondukistan, It's located in in Parvan province in Afghanistan, about 120 kilometers northwest of Kabul. And it's a site that's located also on a hilltop that overlooks the valley. And it's a bit north of the route that passed the Hindu Kush and connected India to Bactria and Central Asia. The site was excavated around the same time as the site of Begram under direction of the Dafa. And they uncovered a temple and an adjoining mud brick building that consisted of numerous cells, congregation halls for the Buddhist community, and other rooms, and some incredibly beautiful statues and paintings. So this is a statue of a royal couple, perhaps a donor with beautiful costumes. And then here are some of the beautiful Buddha and Bodhisattva images from that time. Now, what's interesting about Afghanistan and interesting about the Turk Shahis, that they were quite diverse in terms of their religious traditions or things or sites that they patronize. Because you also dated to that period, you find Hindu statues, such as this one, Ganesh statue, and also the statue of the sun god, the Indian sun god, Surya. Now, most discussion on the Silk Road, right, ceased chronologically in the 8th century with the annexation of Central Asia during the Arab conquest. This is often as a result of the division of the region into a pre-Islamic region of study, into a pre-Islamic and an Islamic period, or pre-Islamic and an Islamic history. And that's a false dichotomy, in my opinion. So much of what we understand of the Islamic period has to do with what came before. But the Islamic era is also associated with commercial networks that are just as dynamic as the ones that came before, and in fact, a continuation of long established lines of communication, which would fuse Central Asia into an even more global trade and exchange network, which would move new ideas and structures, including Islam, across South Asia. And although the coming of Islam would impact Buddhism and Zoroastrianism, conversions were really a fluid process that took many centuries. During the period of annexation, some monuments were destroyed, others continued to flourish under local rule, such as the Shahis described earlier. Buddhism, think of it this way, Buddhism relied on the patronage of political and economic elites. And once those had converted and aligned their activities with the newly established network, Buddhism was deprived really of its sources of power and started to lose its position in Central Asia. Now, interestingly enough, some Buddhist monuments would be absorbed in later non-Buddhist mythologies, like that of the Hazara community of Bamiyan, who refer to the two statues as a couple. And a couple that refers to, prominent figures in a kind of Turkic mythology. So I think, we tend to sort of look at the coming of Islam in primarily destructive sort of terms, in particular to the religions that came before, but that is not really borne out by the evidence. Sure, it happened, but Buddhism survived for centuries while Islam had become the predominant tradition in the area. And that had a lot to do with all these local sort of pockets that I presented today that kept patronizing a slew of different religious trends. So to finalize this talk, during the Islamic period, a series of local dynasties would rule the area, including ultimately the great Indian Mughal dynasties. By the 19th century, though, as I mentioned in the introduction, European colonizers would descend on Central Asia. They would carve it up, map it, they would strip it, and they would line the coffers of European empires. Afghanistan would resist. After 3 hard-fought Anglo-Afghan wars, would retain its independence and chart its own course well into the 1970s. And that's when outside powers went in and, at least in my opinion, started to plunge the country into a chaos that really still reverberates today. So it is, and just to end, it is those sort of 40 years and counting that really have defined the image of and the discussion on Afghanistan. So the story that I wanted to tell today, and trust me, there were probably another 30 slides that I would have loved to show you, was to redirect the view of Afghanistan as a dark hole, seen only and always through the lens of war and terrorism, to a region and a country that has a complex and very dynamic history and a rich and very diverse cultural heritage. So let me stop there because it's past 5 o'clock. I just, I want to thank people who joined the talk today. So thank you very much, and I hope at least you got something out of this presentation.
Sanjyot, thank you so much. That was a fantastic lecture. I learned so many things. Some of the images you showed, like the Vajrapani as Heracles, like I had no idea these existed. That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah. I know some of the material is of course known because some of the background material and Tilya Tepe material went on the hidden treasures, sort of were part of the hidden treasures exhibition that went to 3 places in the US. So I was assuming that people would be slightly familiar with them, and maybe it was a nice sort of reacquaintance with some of that very lovely objects.
Yeah, very much so. For everybody watching, if you have a question, you can pop it into the Q&A below. So if you look down on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, there should be 2 bubbles with Q&A, and we will be happy to take your questions there. And Sanjyot, the questions are rolling in.
Oh no.
So,
oh, great.
We have a question on lantern ceilings.
Mm.
Some scholars have postulated that the ceiling originated from Central Asian houses. Mm-hmm. The same lanterns are found in Han Dynasty Chinese tombs. What is your take on this? For instance, regarding the origins and or diffusion of this type of ceiling?
Right. So there is some suggestion that they were actually part of houses in the larger Persian area, that they were actual, just part of sort of secular architecture, right, of domestic architecture that then got appropriated into, other for other functions, including sort of in the Buddhist context at Bamiyan. So yeah, I know that I always find when it comes to which came first, the chicken or the egg, is always very, very difficult because you don't know what came before what is now extant, right? Right. So sure, I would be willing to sort of, entertain that materials went back and forth, and obviously influences from China could have landed right in Buddhist context in Afghanistan. But I do know there's an archaeology of domestic architecture where that has been identified in Iran. So, but again, these things are so difficult to pinpoint. How do things, who influences whom, when, how? Often you can just point to patterns, but you can't always explain them really well. You can see that there's a link, but it's difficult sometimes to understand what linked them and the directionality of those links. And it happens all the time in our field, and in particular in Silk Road studies, because everything crisscrossed, moves east and it bounces back. So yeah, it's a complex. It would require a very complex analysis that I don't think is possible really with the extant materials that we have at the moment.
All right, thank you, Sanjyot. We have a question. What is the status of the Kabul Museum today?
Yeah, I sort of made it a point of and you may have noticed it, I really didn't talk about the post-2001 period archaeology, because a lot of interesting things happened in the last 20 years archaeologically, but things are so tense at the moment and so uncertain that I thought, I would not highlight anything because I don't know what's happening to those sites in situ. And that includes, of course, colleagues who are heavily involved in these projects and are now facing a very uncertain future where they're not quite sure of how the Taliban is going to view their work. So I know that, and that was published recently, so I know that was in the news, that the Taliban sort of had started to ask about where the Bactrian gold was, or were after sort of trying to get to the Bactrian gold. And I can only imagine the Kabul Museum in that context. So I don't really know, and it will be difficult to ascertain exactly what is going on, partly because nobody wants to broadcast what's going on either, because that can come back and haunt staff at the Kabul Museum, the Institute. So it's such a difficult time. And, I sometimes really don't want to talk about just objects, partly because there is such a human toll right now in Afghanistan. And it's been going on for such a long time. And it's, we're entering a new moment where we really don't know what's going to happen, and the sort of worry about people who are there in our field. I'm saying. So yeah, I tend I hear things once in a while, but I don't tend to really talk about it just because of the situation on the ground.
Yeah, completely understandable. Thank you for that. We have a question about I believe it's the Bamiyan Buddhas. It says, what is the date of the Buddha in the left niche and the Buddha in the right niche?
Yeah, they're roughly the same period in the 6th century CE. Deborah Klimberg-Salter, who you still see on this slide, she, by the way, wrote a fantastic article on the entangled sort of mythologies of Bamiyan, the colossal sculpture. So 6th, there's some speculation that the one on the right was slightly earlier than the one on the left, the higher one, the 55-meter Buddha, but they're roughly in the same time frame. If not, they're not perhaps in the same year, but they're roughly in the same time frame.
We have a question about the hidden treasures of Afghanistan exhibition objects. What happened to them, and are they still traveling?
Yeah, well, I revert back to the question, the answer I gave with regard to the Kabul Museum. But last I was actually tracking it. They were it was like 2 years ago. They were still maybe Hong Kong, if I remember correctly. And after that, I lost track. I don't know where they are. I don't know whether they are abroad or whether they came back. And if I knew, I wouldn't say, I wouldn't not to be flippant. I really, I want people to understand how precarious the situation on the ground really is at the moment. And it's better to just be careful about these things, because the article was pretty clear. I mean, they want to know where it is, and they will pursue that. To what degree it's difficult to imagine.
Very determined. So
yeah.
Okay, we have a question. Could we have a reference or link to more of your writings, published papers, etc.?
Sure. Where are they? It's true. I thought I had a link on my sort of faculty website, but I don't see it anymore. So I should update it. But I'm happy to send anybody. In the meantime, I'm happy to send anybody an email or a PDF of that material. Yeah. Or my writing on that material.
Yeah, we'd be happy to arrange to send it to the listserv.
Okay, all right. Then I'll just forward it to the foundation, and then.
Yeah, and we'll make sure that everybody gets it. So
okay,
stay tuned.
Yeah, sure.
Someone asked, could you comment on the state of Afghan studies in the West today?
Yeah, it's very. I would say it's limited. They're quite, of course, wonderful scholars on Afghan history. There are Afghan scholars, US Afghan scholars on Afghan history, literature. Berkeley, Professor Wali Ahmadi teaches Persian literature and also the history of literary production in Afghanistan. We tried a couple of times over the years to centralize sort of interest in Afghanistan, to create a center or to get a program started, but there was a lot of pushback, partly because even though it floats in between various area studies, people do sort of latch onto it when convenient. So in Middle Eastern studies or South Asian studies, right? You pull it in to some degree. It has a much deeper, I think, history in Europe, and partly that is perhaps because of the engagement, and also because in the early stages of the 20th century, right, there was a lot of contact with European academies and universities and exchanges, and I think that sort of fomented Afghan studies broadly construed, but I couldn't give you a real overall picture in the US, partly because we tend to compartmentalize ourselves anyway, in terms of who does Afghan or who's interested in Afghan archaeology or that particular area, and you still find most scholars are outside of the US.
Well, we're very fortunate to have you, Sanjyot. So.
Well, and I just want to reiterate once again that I'm far from a specialist on Afghanistan. I'm of course interested through my work, and my concern is because of a deep love, for the history and the culture of Afghanistan. But there are many more experts that hopefully you will invite at some point to talk about Afghanistan, and also who have looked, at the connection Buddhist, between Bamiyan and Kizil and Dunhuang, and there's lots of work being produced now and a lot of interest. But of course, Afghanistan remains problematic because it's difficult to conduct in situ research in the region because of the conflict.
Understandably. To emphasize your prior point, Xiaoxu wrote in and said after the exhibition finished in Hong Kong a few years ago with the treasures from the National Museum, all the objects went back to the National Museum. That was the last stop.
Yeah, that's at least sort of on paper what has occurred. Subsequently, I don't know what has happened, where they're stored, where they're kept. So
officially went back, but
yeah, and I think nobody would talk about it. I don't think I would venture to guess that would not be advisable in this moment.
Understandably. We have a comment. Thank you so much for the great talk. I have a question regarding the so-called pearl rondelle pattern on textiles. Why do you think the reason might be that this pattern gains so much popularity among various cultures?
Yeah, I'm not actually the person to answer that effectively, although I base my sort of the idea of this elite culture that developed, right? Where elite strata in different parts of the Silk Road were latching on to a particular sort of dress code or idiom by which they connected themselves internationally. And the person who wrote a very nice article on that, I don't know the title of the article, but is Professor Matthew Canepa. His last name is Canepa, and he's a professor at UC Irvine. And he's been interested in sort of Sasanian political culture and also Sogdian political culture, and how that sort of became interwoven with political elite stratas, also in the Taklamakan area and in China. And that sort of then spurred the production of these textiles, right? Which you also saw with other types of silks in the Byzantine Empire, right? That became fashionable, and it was seen as a status attire to wear, robes that came from that were produced somewhere else, or they're produced in China that were then worn somewhere else. So, but he has, of course, I'm just, he articulates the case in his work. So I would suggest you find his website and look at his published materials, and he's really very, very good.
Thank you so much for that recommendation, Sanjyot.
Yeah, and I try to, on the slides, also just recommend certain studies of people who have really done a deep dive into particular objects or paintings or sites.
And in light of some of the other questions, people have asked if we're going to post this lecture and the slides. Yes, we will. We're going to post this on the Foundation's YouTube page. So if you look on YouTube under Dunhuang Foundation, you can find our channel. And this lecture will be up in about 2 weeks. We're going to send out a notification to everybody once it's posted. So stay tuned for that. We have a question about the Friday Mosque. I saw the beautiful building of the Friday Mosque, and it seems to be decorated with lapis lazuli. Was this common to do this type of decoration?
Yeah, I think some precious materials were used in the mosaic, the faience on the outside. Sometimes it was tile, right? Ceramics, and sometimes it could also be inlaid with specific materials, often sort of turquoise more than I think lapis, but yeah. And the Friday Mosque, that was part of my Islamic part that I didn't get to. As I said, I sometimes try to cover too much and I forget, that 50 minutes is not enough time. I had some slides of that, and of course it was renovated under the Timurids, the Timurid Empire, the Great Timurid Empire, in the 15th century, and made better and bigger, and they were the great patrons of mosques, madrasas, and also the artists, of the Islamic world and the Timurid world.
Excellent, thank you. Someone typed in, I think this is in reference to the Rondells on garments, Silk Road Fashion Project, DAINST, Dienst, Berlin.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's
Yeah.
like a reference.
Yeah.
Marga, thank you for that.
But again,
All right.
Canepa's work really sort of digs into, you know, how this worked in terms of that you know, political culture and how it developed elite status, and how that interconnectedness really sort of spurred, you know, design elements.
So a deep dive into it.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Sanjyot. So we have a question if it would be possible to obtain the text of today's lecture. So I don't know if you want to do that, or if not, we are going to put it up on YouTube so everybody will have the chance to see it again.
Yeah. Yeah, let me think about it. I'm not, you know, I'd have to delete parts of it, partly the Islamic part, because I never got to it. But yeah, I'll take it under consideration. Let me think about it for a couple of days, and then I'll let you know. And if so, I will forward it to the foundation.
Sounds wonderful. Thank you so much. So many people are writing and asking you to come back. So I can only say that the response has been tremendous. Yeah, we really cannot thank you enough, Sanjyot.
Thank you so much.
All right, everyone. So please stay tuned. This entire talk will be posted to YouTube.
Is there still a question by Robert Lee?
Oh, I will send that.
I want to give a shout out.
We do have a question from Robert, but it's in 3 parts, so I will send it to you later.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Robert, I will make a point of getting back to you.
All right. Well, as the thanks and congratulations pour in, people were so happy to attend this lecture, myself included, Sanjyot.
Well, thanks again for the invitation. I really enjoyed it, and I always enjoy being around Chris, and of course we have a partnership too. So I'm you know, very happy to have been a part of your lecture series. So thank you.
We're thrilled to have you here, especially like shedding light on this entire rich cultural history of Afghanistan that often gets obscured in the media. We don't talk about it as much.
Right.
And especially in terms of the foundation's mission, its role as a nexus of the Silk Roads, which is something else that does not get considered in the detail and depth to which it should. So thank you again, Sanjyot. Yeah. As a note, everyone. My
pleasure.
Oh yeah, our pleasure. So as a note, everyone, our next lecture will begin our series on art, environmentalism, and materiality along the Silk Roads. That is the title of the series. This series has been expertly curated by Anne Fung, who is Assistant Professor of Chinese Art at Boston University. Our first lecture in this series will be on November 11th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. So that's Thursday, November 11th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Our first speaker in that series will be Subhashini Kaligotla, who is Assistant Professor of Indian and South Asian Art and Architecture at Yale University. She will be speaking on the image of the stupa in early Deccan India. So further information on that talk is forthcoming. To our viewers, sincere thanks for joining us this evening. We greatly appreciate you and your support. You make this happen, you make this work. Thank you. Once more, I'd like to thank Sanjyot for her fantastic lecture, for which the thanks and congratulations are still rolling in, and to wish you all a very pleasant evening. Good night.
Thank you. Bye.